Great. So welcome everyone to the Regional Resilience Grant Program Round 1 Draft Guidelines Public Comment Workshop for Tribal Governments and Communities. I'm Dolores Barajas. I'm the Program Manager for the Regional Resilience Grant Program, and I'm joining you from Yokuts Land, otherwise known as Fresno, California. And this meeting is being reserved specifically to provide space for tribal communities and organizations. If you're not representing a tribe, we kindly ask that you hop off this meeting and contact us in other ways to learn about the program. And I will include my email in the chat if you'd like to reach out to us. So appreciate you making the space for this specific workshop. Great. So the Regional Resilience Grant Program is a new grant program from the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program, ICARP for short, which is housed in the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. And we're really glad you joined us to learn more about the guidelines and share your input. I want to begin the meeting by acknowledging that the state of California exists on occupied territory of over 110 federally recognized tribes and over 70 non-federally recognized tribes. This land has been stewarded by Indigenous people since time immemorial. We acknowledge the critical importance of these lands and waters to the Indigenous people of California today. So at this time, I would love to invite any tribal leaders or elders we have with us to introduce yourselves. If you can unmute yourselves and introduce yourself, that would be great. Or raise your hand alternatively, or type in the chat. Okay, I don't see any. For everyone else joining us, if you would like to, please share your name, organization, and where you're calling from in the chat. That would be great. And just so we have an idea of who is in the room and where you're joining us from. And I'd also like to introduce our team while you're doing that. I'll turn it over to Lauren.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lauren Marcelia, and I'm the senior planner on the team. I'm calling in from Tongva Land, which is also known as Los Angeles, California.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Kristen Vega Payne, and I'm the associate planner. I'm calling in from Tongva Land, otherwise known as Los Angeles, California.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kate Lyons. I am the assistant planner on the team, and I'm calling in from Ohlone Land, otherwise known as Oakland, California.
Hello, I'm Jocelyn Tapia, and I'm an executive fellow at OPR. I'm calling in from Masonon and Miwok Land, otherwise known as Sacramento, California.
Great, thank you, team. And thank you for those of you introducing yourselves in the chat. Next slide, please. Great, so here is an overview of what we'll discuss today. First, we'll give you a background of our program and review the program's timeline. Then we'll share the highlights from the engagement we conducted that informed our draft guidelines. And after that, we'll dive into specifics on the round 1 draft guidelines, which you can review through the link in the chat. The presentation on the program and guidelines will take us about 30 minutes, and we encourage you to hold your questions and comments until the end of the presentation, where we'll dedicate about 45 minutes to a Q&A session. We'll close out with a quick recap and share other resources. As a reminder, the presentation portion of the workshop will be recorded and shared after the meeting, and the discussion portion of the workshop will not be recorded. We'll also email the slides to you after this workshop, including the links in the chat that we share in the chat. Next slide, please. Now I'll turn it over to Lauren to start our program overview.
Thanks, Dolores. And this workshop is part of a series of workshops to share our draft guidelines and invite public comments. Our series kicked off on January 24th with a general overview workshop of the guidelines to receive feedback from people from across the state. And through the end of this month, we've held workshops on the draft guidelines that have had a regional or community focus. During the public comment period, we want to ensure that we hear a wide array of opinions on how we can further develop the guidelines to meet regional resilience needs. During today's presentation, we'll provide another overview of the guidelines and hear from you and your colleagues from tribal governments and communities. We're hoping that this session will be an opportunity for you to learn more about the program, discuss tribal community-specific comments, and also find potential opportunities to collaborate. Also, just a note that although this is the last workshop of the series, if you have more input, we encourage you to submit your comments on the draft guidelines until the end of the public comment period, which is March 3rd, next Friday. Next slide, please. So as I just mentioned, the public comments on the draft guidelines are due by March 3rd at 5 p.m. Pacific time, which is next Friday. People can submit comments on the draft guidelines by either attending one of these public workshops or emailing comments to the ICARP grants email shown on the slide here. That's icarp.grants@opr.ca.gov. If you'd like to learn more about the public comment process for the guidelines, you can visit our website, which Kate just linked in the chat. Next slide, please. The Regional Resilience Grant Program, which we'll sometimes refer to as RRGP throughout the workshop, aims to support local, regional, and tribal entities' regional scale climate resilience solutions. The program will target funding towards capacity building, planning, and implementation. It also funds projects in either the planning or implementation category, while we encourage applicants in both categories, planning or implementation, to also incorporate capacity building into their projects. In round one, $21.3 million will be available, and at least $12.5 million of those dollars will be awarded to planning activities to support the full life cycle of regional resilience projects through both the planning and implementation phases. Future rounds of the program will only include project implementation funds. Next slide, please. The RRGP uses ICARP's definitions of climate resilience and climate adaptation, which we have on this slide here. I like to review these and provide some resources so everyone knows what we mean when we mention adaptation and resilience. So just for background, ICARP defines climate resilience as the capacity of any entity to prepare for disruptions, recover from shocks and stresses, and adapt and grow from a disruption. Alternatively, ICARP defines climate adaptation as the process of natural or human systems adjusting to a new or changing environment. ICARP collaboratively developed these definitions for climate resilience and climate adaptation with the public through an engagement process. And if you have questions or want to learn more about these terms, we recommend that you review the California Adaptation Planning Guide starting on page 15. And Kate just linked that in the chat. Next slide, please. So this program is one of 3 new grant programs that ICARP is developing as authorized in the 2021 state climate budget to fund local, regional, and tribal climate adaptation and resilience efforts across the state. ICARP's grant programs include this program, the Regional Resilience Grant Program, or RRGP, the Adaptation Planning Grant Program, or EPGP, which just released its application and solicitation, and the Extreme Heat and Community Resilience Program, which is still in the early stages of program planning. If you'd like to learn more about these 3 programs, you can visit the ICARP grants website, which is linked in the chat. Next slide, please. The Regional Resilience Grant Program is oriented around the priorities shown on the slide. The program's distinguishing feature is its regional focus, and we'll touch on how the program defines regions a little later in the presentation. The program aims to fund regional projects that align with ICARP's priorities, including protecting critical infrastructure and building a community's capacity to respond to climate change, and also implementing solutions consistent with the California Climate Adaptation Strategy priorities. The program aims to address the greatest climate risks in each region with a strong emphasis on supporting vulnerable communities. The program includes tribal governments and communities in its definition of vulnerable communities. Next slide, please. So this program aims to fill a need for collaborative resilience projects that reduce climate impacts in the near and long term. Funded projects will strengthen existing collaborations or forge new ones, while integrating local and traditional or tribal ecological knowledge wherever possible. RRGP prioritizes projects at all points in the resilience planning lifecycle, from planned projects to shovel-ready projects, or projects that might just be an ideal idea right now. The program intends to support grantees to integrate capacity building into the process while focusing on vulnerable communities and supporting equitable outcomes. Next slide, please. So over the past year, we've been working on our first round of funding. Last summer, staff conducted a series of listening sessions, and we'll share the main takeaways from those sessions in a moment. After the listening sessions, staff incorporated feedback into the draft guidelines, which we completed and released on January 17th. Right now, staff are finishing this series of public comment workshops and also inviting public comments through email. After the public comment period ends, we'll review and incorporate the comments and release the finalized guidelines in April. At that point, applicants will have about 90 days to apply, and we'll offer technical assistance or TA workshops throughout the application period. Our plan is to announce the awards in early fall. Next slide. And now I'll turn it over to Kristen so she can share the feedback we've heard on the program and start reviewing the elements of the draft guidelines.
Thanks, Lauren. Last summer, we held a series of public listening sessions, key informant interviews, and posted an online survey to inform the development of the Regional Resilience Grant Program. Our program engagement summary, which you can find a link to in the chat, summarizes the feedback we received during this process. A total of 140 organizations were engaged through this process. Next slide, please. In addition to our RRGP engagement activities, our RRGP staff coordinate with other state funding programs to discuss lessons learned. Feedback shared with us from other state programs include that the RRGP should tailor guidelines and technical assistance in a way that recognizes the diversity of tribal communities, should align with other state resources to address community-specific needs, and should prioritize long-term health and wellness as a core component of climate resilience. Through our summer engagement, we also received direct input from tribal governments and communities. Our engagement summary includes region and community-specific feedback we received to inform guidelines during our initial engagement. Takeaways from tribal governments and communities start on page 18. In our listening sessions, community members from tribal governments and communities emphasize that capacity is extremely strained and that tribes do not have the time, resources, or support to build the interjurisdictional buy-in required for regional scale climate resilience work. Staff have tried to accommodate this challenge in several ways. First, the guidelines are intentionally flexible to allow for projects that meet the needs and capacity of tribal governments and communities. Staff have also simplified the application process for the grant program and continue to identify ways to further streamline the process to reduce the time and resource burden of applying. To support with application development, staff will provide technical assistance, which will be touched on in more detail later in the presentation. In addition to other resources, technical assistance will include an application workshop specific to tribal governments and communities. Commenters also emphasize that grant programs typically do not consider the diverse needs of tribal communities. To address this, staff has worked with other state programs to understand the level of flexibility needed for tribal governments and communities. And during the Q&A session, please let us know other ways the guidelines can further support your work. Next slide, please. In addition to regional and community-specific feedback, 3 prominent and reoccurring pieces of feedback from across the state stood out. These points also align with feedback received from tribal governments and communities for the program so far. First, folks asked the program allow applicants to self-identify which region their project serves. Comments indicated that a flexible definition would support a diversity of needs across the state. Second, feedback highlighted the importance of funding sustainable staffing and strategic partnerships to not only work towards resilience, but also build capacity at the regional scale. Participants emphasized the need to support collaboration amongst multiple levels of government to form multi-scale partnerships that prioritize the needs of each region's most vulnerable communities. Finally, feedback highlighted the need to streamline and simplify the grant application and reporting processes to increase accessibility and minimize the amount of work that goes into applying and reporting. To support this, participants requested technical assistance in aligning with other grant programs. Next slide, please. We incorporated the feedback we heard into various components of the program, including the regional definition. The draft guidelines provide flexibility for applicants to define what region their project serves. The guidelines also offer guidance on how applicants should think about regions, including considering shared systems of natural and built environment and shared climate risks. The program requires regional partnerships and at least one lead applicant and at least one co-applicant. Projects should serve a regional scale, which we define as larger than a single jurisdiction. Ideally, diverse partnerships that span jurisdictional boundaries and engage with and coordinate amongst multiple governments and communities will support the projects. Our funding goals try to encourage a regional diversity of projects by aiming to fund at least one project from each of the 9 California Climate Adaptation Strategy regions. Throughout this workshop, we'll release some Zoom polls to hear about your thoughts on different elements of the guidelines. Here's a test Zoom poll question to help navigate the Zoom poll format. It asks what your favorite meal of the day is. The options are breakfast, lunch, dinner, or dessert. Just as a heads up, we won't be releasing your answers to these polls. We will also welcome feedback on all of these poll questions during the Q&A session. Great, thank you for your answers. Looks like dinner is really popular. Now we'll release our first Zoom poll to hear about your thoughts on the flexible regional definition. The question reads, this flexible regional definition supports my needs as a potential applicant. You can answer supportive, neutral, not supportive, or not applicable if you're not a potential applicant. Please take a moment to fill out the poll. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Next slide, please. We'll start our overview of the guidelines with requirements for applicants. On the left, you'll see that eligible applicants for the program include public entities, California Native American tribes, and community-based organizations. Eligible tribes include Native American tribes on the California Tribal Consultation Contact List that the Native American Heritage Commission, or NAHC, maintains per Chapter 905 of the statutes of 2004. And we have the exact code there on the slide. A link to that legislation is available in the chat. Federally recognized tribes serving in the role of lead or co-applicant will not be required to submit a limited waiver of sovereign immunity to OPR. Note that organizations associated with California Native American tribes are categorized as community-based organizations. If a tribal entity, such as a tribal NGO or non-governmental organization, is applying as the lead applicant, it should partner with a California Native American tribe as defined in the eligible applicants section. On the right, we've detailed the program's requirements for co-applicants and partnership. As I mentioned on the previous slide, each project application must include one lead applicant and at least one co-applicant. At least one of the applicants for a project must be a public entity or California Native American tribe. If a public entity applies and plans to focus its project on vulnerable communities, they must partner with at least one CBO to better ensure that they consider and integrate those vulnerable communities' needs into the project. California Native American tribes are not required to partner with a CBO. We're about to release another Zoom poll. To hear what you think about applicant requirements, please take a moment to fill out this question. The question reads, my organization will be able to find co-applicants for my potential project. You can choose from agree, neutral, disagree, or not applicable, or not a potential applicant. Wonderful, thank you for your answers. Okay, great. Thank you for answering. We also have another question launching. The question reads, the applicant definition and partnership models are clear to me. You can choose from agree, neutral, disagree, and not applicable or not a potential applicant. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for your poll responses. These are very helpful. Next slide, please. The program's implementing legislation, SB 170, requires RRGP to have formula funding, which we refer to as set-aside goals. Staff incorporated set-aside goals that target funding towards priority communities into the draft guidelines. The set-asides include allotting at least 25% of funds to projects that focus on disadvantaged communities and at least 10% of funds to projects that focus on California Native American tribes. The program uses Cal and Virus Green to define disadvantaged communities. Native American tribes are defined using California Tribal Consultation Contact List that the Native American Heritage Commission, as mentioned on the previous slide. To ensure geographic diversity of funding allocation, the program also aims to fund at least one project from each of the 9 geographic regions of the California Climate Adaptation Strategy. These regions provide an ICARP standard to ensure geographic diversity. Applicants are not required to use the California Climate Adaptation Strategy regions for their application, and the goal of one project per region is a minimum. Depending on the application pool, more than one project may be awarded in some regions. Finally, the program aims to fund at least 2 projects to establish tribal and rural regional partnerships. Tribal regional partnerships may include partnerships among tribes and tribal organizations or other CBOs, or partnerships among tribes and public entities. Here comes another Zoom poll. We'd love to hear your initial thoughts on the guidelines approach to priority communities and funding goals. Please take a moment to fill out the poll. The poll reads, do these funding goals help to support your needs as a tribal government or community? The options are supportive, neutral, not supportive, or not applicable or not a potential applicant. Okay, wonderful. Thank you for your answers. We're very interested in hearing your more specific and individual feedback on the program's set-asides, especially for establishing tribal partnerships in the Q&A session. Thanks for responding to the poll. Next slide, please. Throughout the grant application phase, staff will provide technical assistance to grantees. Unfortunately, third-party technical assistance is not available for grantees for the first round of the program. Technical assistance will include online application workshops, online office hours, information sharing to foster potential collaboration, and posting frequently asked questions on the RRGP website. We'll hold 5 virtual technical assistance workshops throughout the application period, including 2 general workshops, 1 tribal government and community-oriented workshop, 1 short workshop for southern regions, and 1 workshop for northern regions. The Tribal Government and Community-Oriented Application Workshop will support tribes with forming partnerships and crafting applications. For awarded projects, our RGP staff will provide technical assistance throughout the grant period. We are eager to hear from you during our Q&A session about what technical assistance you anticipate needing during the grant period for your prospective projects. Next slide, please. Wonderful. I'll pass it off to Kate now to continue sharing aspects of our guidelines.
Thanks, Kristen. Grants will be awarded to both planning and implementation projects in the first round. Applicants anywhere in the resilience planning continuum, whether just beginning a vulnerability assessment or implementing a resilience project, are encouraged to apply for the program. Projects should have a regional focus, consider vulnerable communities, and align with at least one of the RRGP goals that Lauren mentioned earlier in the presentation. Stronger proposals will also be consistent with at least 1 climate-related state plan, address at least 2 risks, and offer multiple co-benefits. A wide range of projects are eligible for our program. Our implementation legislation, SB 170, specifically calls out wildfire, sea level rise, drought, flood, extreme heat, and energy resilience projects. OPR cannot fund activities that include legislative lobbying or lawsuits. At this time, OPR also cannot fund environmental studies, plans, or documents normally required for project development under CEQA or NEPA. Next slide, please. So here we've compiled some examples of planning and implementation activities that would be eligible for our program. Planning activities could include typical resilience planning and capacity building activities, such as conducting a regional scale vulnerability assessment, forming a collaborative, aligning plans, or starting an education initiative. Implementation activities could include implementing resilience planning documents, hazard-specific projects, or multi-hazard projects. For both planning and implementation projects, we encourage collaboration amongst California Native American tribes, tribal serving organizations or community-based organizations, as well as public entities where it is feasible. This list is certainly not exhaustive, and the guidelines are intentionally general to allow for many possibilities. More project examples are available in Appendix B of the draft guidelines. The Adaptation Clearinghouse, which you'll find linked in the chat, offers more resources that may support your project, including case studies, plan alignment guides, and data. The Case Studies tab specifically might help spark ideas about creative projects for your region. You can also use the Resources by Topic tab to browse resources by your region's climate risks. Now we're going to release another Zoom poll to hear your thoughts about eligible activities. Please take a moment to weigh in. The poll prompt reads, if you are a potential applicant, do you have a specific project in mind to apply for this grant program? And you can choose all that apply and select multiple responses. So the choices are, maybe you have a potential planning project, an existing planning project, or a potential implementation or an existing implementation project, or maybe you have no project in mind yet. You can also select not applicable if you are not a potential applicant. Great, thank you so much for your responses. We'll be really excited to hear more about the projects that you have in mind for this grant program and some of the challenges that you may face with those. So we really appreciate your responses. Next slide, please. We'd also like to share some case studies for tribal communities that may help you get an idea of the types of projects that could be funded through this program that are a bit more specific to tribal communities and governments. First, the Tribal Marine Stewards Network is an example of the type of project or partnership that could potentially be awarded under this grant program. This network is an alliance of tribal nations working to collaboratively protect and restore coastal and marine ecosystems in ancestral territories. The Tribal Marine Stewardship Network's work addresses climate resilience needs while providing other co-benefits such as economic and community prosperity and cultural vitality. The network also provides opportunity for capacity building for tribes and tribal governments and communities to learn alongside each other while addressing all of their own unique needs. Next, the Southern California Tribal Regional Climate Collaborative is a collaborative funded by the Strategic Growth Council, or SGC, to rapidly and systemically advance climate change mitigation, adaptation, and resilience goals of the Southern California Tribal Chairmen's Association, otherwise known as SCTCA, member tribes, both individually and collectively. The collaborative will identify the climate-related needs and priorities of each tribe while matching their needs and priorities to available funding and other assistance, as well as providing comprehensive support to secure needed funding and assistance, which will result in a continuous stream of successfully completed tribal climate change plans and projects. Both of these projects, the network and the collaborative, are just two examples of how tribes could use funds from this program. The guidelines are intentionally general to allow for tribes to apply for projects that best suit their needs and capacity. You can find links to both the Tribal Marine Stewards Network and the Southern California Tribal Regional Climate Collaborative in the chat. In the Q&A session, we'd love to hear what types of projects you're considering applying for this grant with. Next slide. Before applying, applicants should complete an intent to apply survey, which will be available online prior to the solicitation release. The intent to apply survey will help staff evaluate applicant eligibility and potential for regional collaboration or other funding opportunities. It will also help staff direct resources for technical support. Next slide, please. A review panel will evaluate applications for this program on a competitive basis. Applicants will submit applications through an online SharePoint grants portal. Application questions will align closely with the topical areas mentioned in the scoring criteria section of the guidelines, which start on page 15. The application asks for additional documentation for the different application components, including a budget, work plan, community engagement plan, and letters of support from communities that the project aims to support. In response to the feedback that we received through our engagement process, as well as feedback received for the Adaptation Planning Grant Program, or APGP, the application process we're using for our program looks similar to that of APGP, including the use of a SharePoint grants portal and that intent to apply survey that I mentioned previously. This Zoom poll gauges your initial thoughts on the application process, so we'd appreciate if you could take a moment to respond. The poll prompt reads, "This application model supports my needs as a potential applicant for a streamlined application process." The choices are supportive, neutral, not supportive, or not applicable if you're not a potential applicant. We're really interested to hear your feedback on this application model and its accessibility for you as a potential applicant when we reach the Q&A session. Great, thank you so much for your responses. Next slide, please. This slide details the scoring criteria for applications received for the program. The community needs and priorities component carries the heaviest weight, contributing 20 points to the overall 100 points possible. The consistency with RRGP, state priorities, and local plans component, as well as the climate risk and co-benefits component, the regional partnership component, and the budget component are each attributed 15 points. The proposed project description and goals component and the organizational capacity component both carry 10 points. Next slide, please. Projects can be 12 to 30 months long. And for both planning and implementation projects, grantees and their partners should develop an action plan at the beginning of their grant term. The action plan will identify the project's key activities, member roles and responsibilities, and timelines. The action plan should build on the work plan and the community partnership plan, which are both components of the RRGP application. The action plan should help guide project implementation and hold partners accountable to one another and the community around project activities and outcomes. Grantees will also be expected to monitor their project's impact and evaluate how their project aligns with the program objectives throughout the grant term. A major goal of evaluation will be to ensure that community partnerships meaningfully serve vulnerable communities. Evaluation will consist of progress reports and regular check-ins. Program staff and technical assistance providers will help develop evaluation plans and assess progress throughout the grant term. We're about to launch another Zoom poll for the workshop, and if you could take a moment to respond about your initial reactions to the scoring criteria and program expectations, we'd really appreciate it. So this poll's prompt is: the scoring criteria and program expectations support my needs as a potential applicant for strategic partnerships and capacity building. You can choose from agree, neutral, disagree, or not applicable if you're not a potential applicant. Awesome. Thank you so much for your responses. So throughout our various engagement efforts, as well as engagement efforts for other OPR and SGC programs, staff have received varying input around resolutions, commitment, and other types of agreements for tribes. So we'd like to launch a final Zoom poll of the workshop for you to weigh in on this. This poll's prompt is: please select the statement with which you agree the most, and you can choose from 3 statements. So the first one is: being required to pass a resolution for the grant program would be a challenge for my tribal government or organization. The second is: being required to pass a resolution would neither pose a challenge nor a benefit for my tribal government or organization. And then the third one is: being required to pass a resolution would pose a benefit for my tribal government or organization. You can also choose not applicable if this doesn't apply to you, or if you are not a potential applicant. Or maybe you have no opinion at this time. We really appreciate this, and we'd love to discuss this topic in further detail during our Q&A session and hear what you're thinking. Thank you so much for your responses. Next slide, please. Applicants should ensure that the costs proposed in the project budget section of their application comply with the list of eligible funding activities in the guidelines. In the guidelines, eligible costs are separated into two groups. One group holds eligible costs for both planning and implementation projects, and then activities that are only eligible costs for implementation projects are pulled into a separate category. This list provides a glimpse at the list of eligible costs, and more information is available in the guidelines on page 25. And with that, I'd like to conclude the presentation portion of the workshop, and I'll pass it back to Dolores to kick off the public comment Q&A portion and ask Kristen to pause the recording for our discussion.
As we've mentioned throughout, there are a lot of other opportunities, grant opportunities. So here we've compiled a list of other relevant opportunities to explore from the state, and we'll share a copy of the slides so you can learn more about these programs. This is not an exhaustive list, but if for some reason the Regional Resilience Grant Program is not a good fit for your project, we hope that we can support you to find funding through one of the other many opportunities. Next slide, please. We'd also like to quickly touch on other opportunities offered by ICARP. In March, the ICARP Technical Advisory Council will be meeting to cover extreme heat topics. So this is a great opportunity to hear about upcoming state initiatives, provide input for ICARP to meet on the ground needs, and raise challenges in the extreme heat space. You can sign up for our listserv linked in the chat to receive the March meeting registration information. And we also encourage you to review the Adaptation Planning Grant Program, which we've mentioned throughout the presentation. Their guidelines and solicitation were recently released, and their applications are due March 31st. Also within the ICARP team, the 5th Climate Change Assessment Team recently released the 26 research topics that will help inform the scope of the 5th Climate Change Assessment. The Climate Change Assessment Team is also collaborating with the CEC on the Tribal Research Grant Program, which recently closed its public comment period on the program's guidelines. So you can stay tuned for those final guidelines and solicitation on that program. And finally, the Climate Services Team at ICARP produces meaningful and supportive materials for folks doing resilience work, including the Adaptation Clearinghouse and CalAdapt. So we encourage you to check out those sites. The Climate Service Team is also in the process of developing a vulnerable communities platform. This platform will be an open, accessible, and community-grounded resource to deliver information and data to help decision makers understand and visualize underlying factors that drive vulnerability and future risks to climate impacts. So stay tuned for developments on that exciting resource and how we can integrate it in our program as well. We encourage you to sign up for the ICARP listserv for updates on all of these programs and more. Next slide, please. Finally, we'd like to share our FAQ page on our website. This is a one-stop shop for the most distilled information about the Regional Resilience Grant Program guidelines. We'll update this regularly throughout the grant cycle. A link to the FAQs is available in the chat. Next slide. So for more information on our program, you can visit our website or join our listserv, and we will be sharing the recording of the presentation section of this workshop soon. We thank you all for joining the workshop today and providing your feedback. We really value and appreciate your time and interest in the program, as well as your thoughtful comments. These workshops will help us improve the program, and with that, we will conclude the workshop. Thank you all for coming. And we can stay on the line if there are any additional questions.